osmosis works is to compare it to the different osmotic processes. And so the first one you have is osmotic equilibrium, which is where your hydraulic pressure, your delta P, is equivalent to your osmotic pressure, your delta pi, and so there's no movement across the membrane. The second type is reverse osmosis, which is what happens with desalination, where you have a greater hydraulic pressure than your osmotic pressure, and so you can separate the pure water from the brine. Then there's forward osmosis, which is where you don't have that hydraulic pressure, and so everything's just driven by the osmotic pressure, and so the pure water will flow across the membrane into the brine side, and this is what happens inside of our bodies. And the final one that we're going to be talking about in this talk is pressure retarded osmosis, which is where you have a hydraulic pressure and an osmotic pressure, but the hydraulic pressure is less than that osmotic pressure, so you still have the pure water flowing into the brine side. And since that brine side is pressurized and it's a constant volume, this creates an extra pressurized flow that you can then harness and send through a turbine. And some of the preliminary modeling that we've done has shown that if you do it pressure retarded osmosis with a seawater desalination and wastewater process, you can recover anywhere from like 10 to 14% of the energy used in seawater desalination. But pressure retarded osmosis also has its own issues in terms of concentration polarization, which is a reduction in salinity gradient caused by the buildup of solutes along a membrane surface. And you can see that in this graphic right here, where you have external concentration polarization with this blue line representing your salinity gradient, and internal concentration polarization. And this makes the gradient go from like this larger gap right here to these smaller gaps just due to that concentration gradient. And this can be reduced with membrane spacers, but the membrane spacers have a drawback of increasing a pressure drop along the length of the feed channel. And so the work that I'm going to be presenting is showing how you can design a membrane spacer that can minimize both the effect of pressure drop along the length of the feed channel as well as concentration polarization. So in order to do that, I've had the research question of what effect does membrane spacer geometry have on pure membrane hydraulic performance, and how can it be improved? And this task is broken down into subtasks of experimentation, simulation, and optimization. So in terms of the experimental setup, we had a custom-built test skid that we were able to isolate individual parameters using 5 different spacer geometries. And the data in the test skid was logged autonomously and post-processed using Python and MATLAB scripts, with experiments running for about 1.5 hour-long intervals. And you can see in the graphic A, where the system had, a feed tank, which is the low salinity side, and a draw tank, which is the high salinity side. Everything ended up flowing into the membrane system, which has, the water flowing from the draw feed side to the draw side. And then everything was connected with pressure sensors, conductivity sensors, a temperature controller, as well as electrical balance. So there's a lot of data that was generated from this skid and was able to be fed into the processing scripts that we created. In terms of the membrane spacers that we were looking at, there were 5 different types, which you can see in this graphic. And it's important to note that the experiments that we had ran at 16 bars of pressure at 4 different salinity levels, where we used DI water on the feed side. And we varied the salinity on the draw side using NaCl, and this was done to determine the membrane transport parameters A, B, and S. In terms of the simulation, we used computational fluid dynamics. And so we were able to create the meshes using FreeCAD. We did the CFD simulations using OpenFoam. And then we also did some scripting and automation using Python and the command prompt shell script. And we did an optimization for spacer geometry using a software suite called Dakota. In terms of the computational domain for the CFD, we had the governing flow equations where we have your mass conservation and momentum conservation, and these two make up your Navier-Stokes equations. We also had the convection diffusion transport equation because the system was transporting a solute, and so that's important to have as well. And we solved everything using the simple algorithm. And you can also see the computational domain in this graphic right here, where there was an inlet and an outlet. The membrane was on the top side, and it's important to note that we would only simulate one side of the membrane, which in this case is the feed side or the low salinity side. In terms of the geometry that we modeled with the CFD, there are 5 different types of geometries, which you can see in this graphic. It's the same as the geometries in the experimental component. And these geometries are based on an 18 by 9 millimeter cross section with the number of mesh shells ranging from 2 to 4.4 million. And then, with the CFD, we're able to see how different spacers perform. And so once we had that highest performing spacer, we then optimized the geometry of it. And so we did this optimization using a single objective genetic algorithm with a goal to design membrane spacers that can maximize the membrane flow JW and minimize that pressure drop across the membrane channel length delta PD. And the objective function that basically does what I just said. And so from the experimental results, like I said, we ran experiments for all 5 different membrane spacers, and we collected the membrane transport coefficients A, B, and S. And from these collected coefficients, we also did like a validation, and we had a high degree of certainty for most trials with an average of R squared of greater than 0.9, which shows that the fitting that we did was accurate. In terms of the individual performance across the different spacers, we found that the 31D had the highest JW, or the highest water flux, at about 19.79 liters per meter squared hour. And the 47P had the lowest pressure drop by far, where the rest of them had a pressure drop ranging between like 7 and 5 bars, but the 47P, due to its unique parallel structure, had a pressure drop of about half a bar. And so this kind of outlines that there's a performance trade-off between membrane flux and pressure loss, where the spacers that have a higher flux don't necessarily have the lowest pressure loss. In terms of comparing the experimental results to the CFD results, we found that the trend in the water flux matched across both the CFD and the experimental trials with the JW. You can see that in the middle bar in these graphics. And we also found that the trend in the pressure drop matched except for the 65D spacer, where with the CFD, the 65D spacer had an abnormally low pressure drop. And so this discrepancy in the 65D could be due to a couple different things, like differences in operational conditions across the trials, pressure sampling positions, experimental error, or just some kind of limitation in the simulation due to one side being simulated or just something else. Like, that's the beauty of simulating complex stuff. In terms of the results from the CFD, this graphic shows the velocity flow fields overlaid over the pressure gradients. And so in these graphics, the velocity flow fields, they're colored from blue to red, and then the pressure gradient is colored from black to red in the background. And in these graphics, you can see that the main trend that we identified is that increasing the void space, which is just the amount of space that the fluid can flow through, and orienting spacers in a parallel fashion allows the fluid to travel more freely. And you can really see that when you compare the 47D and the 47P spacers, because they're the same geometry, they're just rotated 45 degrees. And you can see in this corner specifically how it creates like a high pressure buildup in a high velocity area that you don't really get with the parallel geometry because it's not intersecting it. In terms of how the spacers affect the salinity fields, we found that areas with higher velocity would push the salt away and create a reciprocal effect. And again, you can see that in this area right here where we had that high velocity stream, and then it creates kind of like a ripple effect from the salt moving away from a high velocity area, while lower velocity areas would actually carry salt in the streamline. And again, you can see that in this one specifically where you have this lower velocity streamline, and then it also is able to carry that salt away. So using these results, we then did the optimization, and we decided to do it on that 47P spacer, this one right here. And with the optimization, we had each simulation with the mesh containing about 2 to 3 million hexahedral cells. We did 365 simulations spread across 102 generations, and the calculation took about 9 days. I went on vacation while this was happening, so it was great. My computer worked while I didn't have to. And the initial generation, the values range from about -39 to +7% efficiency. And you can see that right here where all the bubbles are spread out across the solution space. But the final generation, which was the optimized generation, showed that the variables were able to converge within 8%. And so, they go from being spread out all over the place to being right on this one spot. So that's where we decided to cut off the simulation because it was essentially able to converge right here. In terms of the optimized geometry, like I said, we did the optimization on the 47P spacer, and we were able to improve the system performance by 16.3% compared to the baseline. And in terms of the changes of geometry, we found that the RSN, which is the radius of the small thin, the purple section, stayed relatively constant, while the length of the slope of the thick and the thin section were retracted. So, you can see in this graphic right here where the orange section juts out on the top, but then it's non-existent on the bottom. And same thing with this one also gets shorter. So it kind of creates like a simpler, more hexagonal geometry. What this really does to the velocity fields is, like I said, it made a simpler, more hexagonal shape, which created a smoother flow field and decreased the pressure drop that was caused by that spacer matrix. And so you can see like in these graphics right here, where it creates more of a high velocity and high pressure drop section in the original geometry. But since you don't have those slope sections in that area, it doesn't have as high as the velocity, and it kind of, also equalizes the pressure a bit more. In terms of what it does to the salinity fields, increasing the linearity in the channel between the spacer strands would cause that salinity bulge around the edge of the spacer to become rounder and more continuous. And so you can see that in these salinity fields right here, where the salinity streamline is kind of broken up. But in the area where you don't have this jetting section out, you can see that the salinity streamline is a bit more continuous and well-formed. And so this allowed for increased transport of salt away from the membranes, which was able to decrease the average salinity by 2%. So, making these simpler hexagonal geometries in your spacer and having like higher quality extrusion processes will really enable less salt buildup along the membrane surface, which can also reduce the impacts of concentration polarization. And so this goes to the key findings where, we identified that there was a trade-off between decreased pressure buildup in the feed side versus increased transport across the membrane. We also found that optimization results suggest that spacer manufacturers should place emphasis on keeping the spacer strands more linear and decreasing the length of the slope section of the thin crunch strand to increase the system performance. And finally, we also found that our study had broader implications for the CFD and virtual prototyping communities, as all the algorithm for the optimization, we used 100% open source software for everything that we did. And so this could easily be transported to other geometries in case you want to optimize the world. And so I'd like to acknowledge all of the people who helped me, as well as the people who provided the funding to carry out this research. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. And I'd also like to note that the CFD code and the optimization algorithm developed are available on my GitHub account. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the wonderful presentation. Let me see if the audience have some questions. So I want to ask a question first. You in this work you did something. You researched the size of the mesh, the influence of the size of the mesh on the FOPL process. If the shape of the mesh will have some influence on the flood and anything in the PL process, the shape of the shape of the mesh.
Oh, you mean like the shape of the spacer?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a couple of different geometric differences. Like these ones are more of like a diamond shape, but this one, is more of like a parallel shape. And so that was kind of one of the trends that we really found, was that the ones that had more of like a regular consistent geometry, like the 31D, you ended up getting more transport across the membrane, a higher JW, because it provided more opportunities for the water to go across the membrane because there are more barriers. But the ones with that simpler geometry where there's less impediments to the flow, you got a much lower pressure buildup on the feed side of the membrane, because there's not as many obstacles for the fluid to travel around. And so it's kind of just, you have to find that fine balance between increasing your membrane transport while also making sure that your pumps aren't running very hard. So it's a lot of little things, and that's the fun part about doing all this type of stuff.
Okay. If the audience do not have questions, we should stop this talk and move to the next. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you again for Benjamin. And okay, the next presentation is will be by me, since Professor Ren is not here, so I should introduce myself to you. Okay, so I will directly begin my presentation. And good afternoon, everyone. This is Zhikan Yao from the College of Chemical and Biological Engineering. It's my pleasure to have this chance to report my work here. The topic of my presentation is thin film composite membrane prepared on reactable substrate via interfacial polymerization. This is outline. It is made up of 4 parts. First, I want to give a brief introduction of this work. As we all know, reverse osmosis, nanofiltration, and forward osmosis have been widely applied in water purification and production, such as desalination, domestic seawag treatment, industrial wastewater treatment, and drinking water production. Most of the commercial RO, NF, or FO membrane are thin film composite membrane. We call the TFC membrane for short. As shown in the picture on the left, TFC membrane is usually composed of a thin polyamide selective layer on the top. The thickness of it is lower than 200 nanometers, and porous substrate in the middle, and thick non-woven layer at the bottom. And TFC membrane was usually prepared via interfacial polymerization. The picture in the middle shows IP process, and the picture at the bottom is a typical reaction equation of MPD and TMC. The performance of the TFC membrane was determined by structure and the composition of the selective layer. Thus, many remarkable works had been reported to improve the performance of TFC membrane. The mostly applied strategy is directly adjusting the selective layer structure. For example, TFN membrane and aquaporin embedded TFC membrane, 3D printed TFC membrane, and the TFC membrane with Turing structured surface morphology, and nanobubble contained TFC membrane. An alternative strategy for membrane improvement was arose as construction an interlayer at the top of the porous substrate before interfacial polymerization, with the help of the interlayer An ultra-thin selective layer could be prepared, and the polyamide intrusion into the pore of the substrate could be eliminated, and the Guter effect was found by Professor Tang. The interlayer provides additional channels for water to permeate. From this work, we found that the structure and the composition of the substrate also have great influence on the formation of the PA layer. If we could prepare a fine substrate, performance of TFC membrane prepared thereon should be also fine. Thus, our strategy to improve the performance of the TFC membrane could be summarized as construct a reactable substrate to participate into and influence the IP process. Based on our previous work, firstly, we prepared several types of reactable substrates. PDA nanoparticles, hydroxyl groups, or amino groups were introduced onto the surface of the reactable substrate. Then the interfacial polymerization of MPD and TMC, or PIP and TMC, were carried out thereon. The influence of the surface composition of the substrate on the formation of selective layer were investigated. Then I will show the results. First, it is the work on the hydroxyl group contained substrate. According to the SEM and XPS analysis, it is confirmed that 3 substrates with similar bulk and surface structure but different surface hydroxyl group content were successfully prepared. Then the interfacial polymerization will operate thereon. And 2 reaction conditions, the condition that's using high concentration, using MPD with high concentration and low concentration were studied. First is the results for the high concentration condition. From the SEM images, we could find the similar ridge and valley surface structure of all of the 3 TFC membrane. This is a typical surface morphology of polyamide formed by IP process between MPD and TMC. Then from the cross-section SEM, we found that the thickness of the selective layer increased with the increasing of the surface hydroxyl group content. From XPS results, the increased carbonium group content of TFC1 and TFC2 indicates the formation of ester groups. It is evidence of the reaction between hydroxyl groups at the surface of the substrate and TMC. It is also indicated the participation of the substrate into the IP process. The prepared TFC membrane showed a negatively charged surface, and with increasing and due to the formation of the hydrophobic ester groups, the surface hydrophilicity of the prepared TFC membrane based on the reactable substrate reduced. Then we test the filtration performance of the prepared membranes. Here we prepared another control TFC membrane on the inert PVC substrate TF3. This membrane showed similar water permeability with TFC1, but much higher salt permeability, which means much lower salt rejection. Thus, constructing the selective layer on a reactable substrate, the salt rejection would be improved without the reduction of water permeability. A conceptual mode was proposed to explain the results and the role of hydroxyl group contained reactable substrate in the interfacial polymerization process. The role of the substrates with low reactivity could be summarized as first the MPD enrichment loader, which could be confirmed by the QCM results, which was shown which was shown on the left, on the right, and second, the reactive monomers. Then in the low concentration condition, the selective layer on the inert substrate, we can find many defects on the surface of on the membrane surface, while a thicker selective layer of approximately 20 nanometer was formed on the reactable substrate, and no obverse and no pinholes could be observed. Then XPS analysis were carried out. The TFC membrane prepared on the reactable substrate showed a much weaker chlorine peak, which means the formation of a thicker selective layer, and a much stronger nitrogen peak, which means the formation of more polyamide. And the East group, the signal of the East groups were only observed in the TFC membrane prepared on the reactable substrate, which means the reaction, which prove the reaction between TMC and the substrate. Then is the performance of the prepared TFC membranes due to the formation of defects contained the selective layer. The controlled TFC membrane showed high water flux but low salt rejection. But the TFC membrane prepared on the reactable substrate showed much higher salt rejection, greatly improved salt selectivity, and relatively low water flux due to the reinforcement of the hydroxyl group contained copolymer chain to the thin polyamide layer. Then the next work, we do something on FO membranes. Many papers have reported that using nanofiber as a substrate for the formed TFC FO membrane would show improved performance due to the greatly reduced S value of the membranes. We followed this work, prepared the nanofiber substrate, and formed a polyamide selective layer by interfacial polymerization of MTD and TMC thereon. Finally, we tested the FO performance. However, something unexpected happened. We did not observe the high water flux in the FO test. Instead, we found the high salt flux because the selective layer would pull away from the substrate spontaneously. We must missing some key points on the preparation of such a nanofiber substrate supported TFC membrane. To solve this problem, PDA nanoparticle was deposited on the surface of the nanofibers and to form a reactable substrate with high reactivity. On the right shows the SE image of the nanofiber substrate and the TFC membrane prepared thereon. The surface of nanofiber substrate was obviously covered by the nanoparticles. And after the IP process, we can see that for the TFC membrane based on the inert substrate, the imprints of nanofibers were obvious, while for the TFC membrane on the reactable substrates, the imprints become weaker. Then a destructive test was operated. For the control TFC membrane, the PA layer could be easily pulled out from the substrate, while the TFC membrane on the modified substrate showed greatly improved adhesion strength. We can see the SEM from figure D. Even the nanofiber substrate was destroyed, the selective layer was still adhered thereon. Then the FO performance of the prepared membrane was tested again by using sodium chloride as a draw solution. The TFC membrane showed high water flux and high high heavy metal ions rejection. With the experience on the formation of selective layer on the substrate with high reactivity, we did further exploration. This work had been reported by my student Mr. Kun Qian in the last reverse osmosis session. So I will skip the details since the time limited. Briefly, we prepared the PS substrate with a surface amino group contained in the low PIP concentration condition. Defect-free thin and much thinner selective layer could be formed, and in the high concentration condition, a thin selective layer without PA intrusion could be formed. Then the XPS result on the back surface of the selective layer proved the reaction between the emanated PS substrate and TMC due to the appearance of the signal of sulfide. Then the performance of the TFC membrane prepared on the substrate with high reactivity was tested. This membrane should improve the permeability, sodium chloride to sodium sulfate selectivity. Finally, the role of the substrate with high reactivity was summarized as PIP loader, PIP diffusion hinder, and PIP intrusion inhibitor. Finally, the conclusion: construct a PA selective layer on a reactable substrate. Defect on the surface of the selective layer can be avoided. Microstructure of the selective layer can be adjusted. Adhesion strength between selective layer and the substrate can be enhanced. Permeability and the selectivity of the TFC membrane can be improved. The role of the reactable substrate in IP process: the loader of aquaphase monomer, the hinder of diffusion of the aquaphase monomer, and the participator in IP process, and the inhibitor of PA intrusion. Finally, I want to acknowledge the funding support from NSFC and the support by Professor Lin Zhang from ZGU and Professor Zhang Tang from HKU and the group member of my team. And thank you for your attention. Okay, I will stop my sharing. I see questions. How to improve the reaction between the substrate and how to improve. This question is that how to improve the reaction between substrate and the monomer. How to improve? I think we could adjust the content of the reactive group and the reactivity of the functional group on the substrate surface.